So good morning, everybody. Hello, and welcome to the Lane County Master Gardeners Virtual Fall Festival. The Master Gardeners are happy to finally to be able to bring these gardening classes to you via Zoom. The wildfires and smoke brought an unexpected delay, and we are glad that all of you are able to make it this time. My name is Jan, and I will be your host today. I have been a Master Gardener since 2014 and I'd like to tell you a little bit about Master Gardeners. Excuse me. Master Gardeners are trained volunteers who offer sustainable gardening information to their communities through education and outreach programs. These programs have included booths at farmers markets, seminars at extension office, classes at home shows and community centers, and demonstrations at composting sites. Master Gardeners also offer home gardening advice on planting, fertilizing, vegetable gardens, diagnosing plant disease, insects, and much more from our plant clinic and mobile plant clinics. Although our usual avenues of reaching out to you and the Lane County community have currently been restricted because of COVID-19, Master Gardeners are still available remotely from the plant clinic to answer gardening questions and through Zoom seminars like the one you're currently viewing, the Fall Festival. To find out about other webinars we are offering, please friend Extension on Facebook or look under upcoming events online on the Lane County Master Gardener webpage. I will put the online link to our webpage in the chat box along with our plant clinic contact information so we can continue to help you answer your home gardening questions. Our first class is from now until noon will be on cover crops, following at noon by Some Like It Hot composting questions answered. From 1 to 2 p.m. we'll be saving seeds, and to wind up our day from 2 to 3 p.m. by the Lane County Master Food Preservers, what to do with all that squash, everything you ever wanted to know. Before we get started, I'd like everyone to know that during the sessions, everyone will be muted. There will be time for questions during each session. To ask questions, please enter your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. For some, such as iPads, the Q&A box may be at the top of the screen. We will answer as many questions as we can during the time allotted. If you have any additional questions, please contact your local extension service. Other information such as links will be entered in the chat box. There will be about 5 minutes between each class to allow the next group to set up their presentation. So let's finally get started. As mentioned, our first class, cover crops, will teach you what cover crops are, their benefits, and which types you should be growing. Our speaker for this class is Chernoh. Erica is a sustainable agricultural specialist who has been working professionally in extension, project management, regulatory, and research related positions for over 15 years. Erica currently serves as the commercial and community horticultural specialist for OSU Extension Lane County. Previously, Erica held a joint position between Chemeketa Community College, where she taught horticulture, and OSU, where she assisted with organic and olive research trials at NWREC. Erica has extensive experience working with organizations to develop participatory training and research programs for the transfer of appropriate technologies. Go ahead, take it away.
Great, good morning. I'm just going to do a share screen real quick. And there we are. Let me get this slideshow. There we go. Okay, so this morning we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is cover cropping. So there's a lot of great benefits to cover cropping. I've received a lot of questions from Master Gardeners since I started my position in August of 2019 about cover crops and how to use them in and around a garden. So I'm excited to be here this morning to talk about this topic with you. So what is a cover crop? It's essentially some type of crop that you're going to grow that you don't intend to harvest. So there's not any type of harvestable portion. There are some exceptions to that. You can grow things like favas and peas as a cover crop. And of course, harvest the peas and favas and still get some cover crop benefits out of them. But most likely you're going to be growing things like clover or a winter rye or something that doesn't really have a harvestable crop. Cover crops can be either annual crops where they complete their life cycle within 1 year, one season. They can also be perennial, and you'll commonly see those used in perennial cropping systems such as vineyards or orchards, et cetera. And some are even biennial as well. So you can grow cover crops as either a pure stand, meaning just one type of cover crop, so a full field of crimson clover, or you can do mixed, where you have a cover crop mix, where you have different species of plants, maybe you have a grass and a legume, and those are kind of mixed together. And that's usually the most common, just because you get different benefits from those different types of plants. So they can be grown during certain parts of the year. The most common time of year is during the winter. So most farmers grow a winter cover crop because their field is typically fallow during that period. But they provide a lot of great benefits, and we'll go through those, all the benefits to soil and nutrients, and also some pest management as well. Typically, a cover crop is going to include what's referred to as a nitrogen fixer. So nitrogen fixing legumes. So legumes have symbiotic relationships with a certain type of bacteria referred to as rhizobial bacteria. And that bacteria has, the potential to take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into a plant available form. And they do that by forming these little nodules on the root. So after in the spring, when your winter cover crop is done, you're getting ready to terminate it and turn it back into the soil. When you do that, the plant is then going to release all that nitrogen that it's storing in the nodules on these roots back into the soil. So it can actually be like a natural fertilizer as well. And that's why they're commonly referred to as green manures. You may have heard that term used as well. So most typically people plant cover crops in the winter time just because you aren't growing other things during that time of year. So if your garden typically sits fallow or bare during that time of year, you may want to consider planting a cover crop during that time. So to do that, you're going to need to plant in late summer, early fall. I know I'll get a question whether or not it's too late to plant right now. It's getting really close. You typically want to plant about 4 to 6 weeks before the first frost, which is usually sometime in mid to late October in this part of Oregon. And so it is getting a bit late. Having said that, I have planted cover crops really late before, had a little luck. You would want to do something that's a little more cold hardy, like a winter rye. But with winter cover crops, you plant them late summer, early fall. Typically you want to do it in about August or even September. They germinate, they grow over winter, and then in the spring you would cut them down and turn them in so that they have time to decompose before you plant your spring garden. So in most temperate cropping systems, this is usually how cover crops are used. And there's a lot of great benefits to that. In the wintertime, we get a lot of rain here, which can cause soil erosion. So having the soil covered protects the soil from rain and other elements, hail and wind and other things like that. And so it's just a great way to conserve the soil during the winter time. You can also grow those, legume species that will add nitrogen to the soil. You're going to build up organic matter in the soil. Winter cover crops are great for kind of suppressing winter weeds as well. So if all of a sudden your garden gets taken over by a bunch of winter weeds in the winter time, you can actually suppress those weeds with the cover crops. And they also just help improve water infiltration. If water hits bare soil, it's most likely going to run off. If it hits a soil covered in a plant, that plant is going to slow down the raindrop, and it's going to kind of store it and give it time for that water to move into the soil before it runs off the surface. So it's really great for water, improving water infiltration. So if you're gardening on sloping soil, this is an important practice as well. You can also grow cover crops in the summer though, and this is becoming more common. If you have a portion of your garden that you just aren't using one year, you can grow a summer cover crop. These are planted in early spring and then cut down during the summertime. But You can grow like a buckwheat, which is really great for attracting pollinators and beneficial insects. You can, of course, it's going to smother a lot of summer weeds. So if you have a certain patch of your garden that's really taken over by weeds, you can consider a summer cover crop to help suppress those and break up their life cycle a little bit. And of course, you get all the benefits of nitrogen fixation and organic matter accumulation as well. And then, as I noted earlier, in perennial cropping systems such as orchards or even like blueberry farms, or if you're driving around the Willamette Valley, you may see some vineyard that have crops or plants or grasses or things growing beneath between the rows of vines. And this is becoming more common to plant a perennial cover crop in these areas, just to cover the soil, reduce erosion, improve fertility, etc. With orchard systems, it's usually, easiest to do in the first couple years of the tree's life, because at that point the trees are small and they aren't necessarily blocking out sunlight. If you look at around the valley, if you were to see, say, an old hazelnut orchard, it's pretty shady. And at that point it is, once the orchard is established, you have this huge cover crop, they're going to kind of shade out the cover crop. So it can be challenging to do in older orchards, but in younger orchards, it's certainly a good practice. So as I noted, there's a lot of great benefits from cover crops. They really kind of became important many years ago after the big Dust Bowl effect that caused this huge erosion crisis here in the Midwest of America. Out of that was born the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And one of the first things they started doing was really start pushing this idea of leaving your land fallow or bare is not good for the soil, and it can lead to these major erosion events. So at that point in time, farmers started slowly introducing cover crops into their cropping system and their rotation system. You get a lot of great enhanced soil structure. So the cover crop grasses and things like that, they're going to put down roots that are going to help kind of hold together the soil and help improve the aggregate structure of that soil, which increases the porosity of that soil, which makes it easier for water to infiltrate and kind of drain through that soil. That porosity is also going to improve the aeration of its soil. And also help reduce, compaction and soil erosion and things like that. Again, as I noted, you can also increase the nitrogen content of the soil by using a nitrogen fixing cover crop. And cover crops are really great for building up organic matter in the soil. So if you have a really poor soil, maybe a heavy clay soil, one of the best ways to fix that is to add organic matter. That organic matter is going to kind of improve porosity in the soil. It's going to increase the nutrient cycling in that soil as well. It also provides a lot of food for all the beneficial organisms, the bacteria and fungi, and those things that live in the soil. So you're essentially feeding the soil food web by using cover crops as well. There's, of course, a lot of great environmental benefits from cover crops. As I noted, reduced runoff and erosion, also prevents nutrients from leaching out of the soil and into our groundwater. And there's also some pest management benefits from using cover crops as well. A lot of them are flowering species that can attract beneficial organisms into your garden. It can provide food for pollinators. As I noted, weed suppression is kind of a major benefit of cover crops. And there's even some that have certain chemicals in them that can act as pathogen suppression as well. So I'll go through a few of these benefits in greater detail. So as I noted, one of the main reasons people started using cover crop was to conserve the soil and reduce runoff and erosion. So what happens when a soil is bare is that a raindrop is essentially going to hit the soil, and that the impact of that raindrop, the force of it, is essentially going to break apart those soil particles that are at the soil surface. And once those soil particles are detached from the aggregate, they're much easily washed away by either wind or water. So having some above ground biomass or crop that's covering the soil essentially protects the soil from that force, that impact of the rain or the wind, and reduces the amount of detached particles. Also having a really good root system, again, is going to kind of increase the pore space. It's going to create some biopores at the surface of the soil, and that's going to really allow that soil to then, or the water to infiltrate into the soil rather than run off across the surface. So that's one of the major benefits of cover crops, and one of the reasons that people started using them historically. So soil cover is really important. It's something that I, when I used to teach, I used to kind of hammer it into my students' head, the importance of soil cover, even just having a 5% cover, whether through cover crops or even some type of straw mulch or something. Even just that small amount of cover can reduce inter-reel erosion and things like that by up to 10%. Obviously, the greater cover, the more area of the ground that you have cover, the greater benefits in terms of reducing runoff and erosion. As I noted, it increases the organic matter. So all these cover crops, they're made up of nitrogen and carbon, kind of like, you think of compost, people talk about the carbon to nitrogen ratio of compost. Well, these cover crops contain those things as well. And carbon and nitrogen are food for all the bacteria and fungi and other beneficial organisms that live in the soil. That carbon and nitrogen gives them food, gives them energy, allows them to kind of build their cell walls and things like that. So when you're adding organic matter into the soil, people usually say you're feeding the soil, because you're essentially feeding all those beneficial organisms in the soil that play such an important part of our soil food web and our soil ecology. So things that add a lot of organic matter tend to be the grass species. They just have, first of all, they're slower to decompose. They have a lot of cellulose and lignins in them, so they have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio. So they are going to be slow decomposers, but typically once they do eventually break down and decompose fully, what you're left with is the end product, which is humus. And that humus it is more of a stable product. It has this really kind of electrical conductivity to it that allows it to exchange nutrients with the soil. And these grass species also produce a lot of biomass, both above ground and below ground. All that root matter, that's going to die and decompose into the soil and really increase the organic matter content of the soil. Nitrogen fixation is also really important. You can actually, as I noted, it does need to be the legume species that they're the ones who have the capability to do this. They have that symbiotic relationship with rhizobium bacteria. So in that little picture there on the bottom right-hand corner of the presentation, that's a root nodule. So those are the little nodules that show that the rhizobial bacteria have essentially colonized the root and are exchanging carbon. So they're taking some carbon from the plant, and in return, they're taking atmospheric nitrogen and turning it into a plant available form. So when you cut down the cover crop and turn that back into the soil, all that nitrogen that those bacteria have fixed into those root nodules, that gets released back into the soil. So it's essentially a natural fertilizer. Our atmosphere has, I think it's like 72% nitrogen in it. So it's able to take some of that out of the nitrogen and fix it back into the soil. And of course, nitrogen is one of the most important nutrients that plant needs in terms of producing green growth and whatnot. So a cover crop can, add anywhere from 40 to 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That's significant. If you think, I always give strawberries, I work a lot with strawberries. I give that as an example. They need about 110 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. So you can get almost, somewhere from half to all of that essentially from growing a cover crop. So obviously the greater the stand, so if you have that little table shows that if you have a cover crop that grows, say, we'll choose red clover. If it's, maybe you got it in late, it didn't germinate well, it was kind of a small growth and the plant itself was less than 6 inches, you're going to get about 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre from that. If you get a really good stand out of it, you can get anywhere from 50 to 80 pounds of nitrogen. So it really varies depending on the species, the amount of biomass, etc. I will note that Oregon State University developed what's referred to as a cover crop calculator, because in the past, a lot of farmers really had no idea how much nitrogen or how much benefit they were getting from their cover crops. So they can now kind of, go into their field and randomly cut out a couple quadrants of their cover crop species, just the above ground part, mix it all together, stuff it in a bag, and send it off to a laboratory at Oregon State University. And they'll get a report back that tells them how much nitrogen is estimated that they'll be getting from that cover crop. And they can use that to then determine how much fertilizer they would then need to add the following year. So the science of cover crops is becoming a lot more advanced as well. Another really important component of cover crops is it reduces leaching. So a lot of, nitrate, it's a nitrogen fertilizer. A lot of that, it's also an anion. So it can leach out of the soil really easily, and it ends up in our groundwater. You've probably heard of nitrate contamination of groundwater. Has a lot of negative health effects, both for aquatic species, but also humans as well. So we really want to try to, prevent nitrogen from leaching into our groundwater. And a great way to do that is by planting a cover crop, particularly in the winter here in Oregon. Again, we get a lot of rain. So you plant a cover crop, any of that nitrate that was sitting in the soil that would maybe typically get leached out of the soil. If you didn't have a cover crop, it's going to be taken up by that cover crop, stored in the plant tissue over winter. And then when you turn that cover crop back into the soil the following spring, all that nitrogen will be released then into the soil right at the time that you're planting your summer garden, and it's there and available for those plants that you're then putting in the ground. Okay, so weed suppression is also really important. So, they just kind of outcompete any weeds for light and water and nutrients and things like that. There are some cover crops like Sudan grass or even rye that have what's referred to as allelopathic effects. So they have these chemicals that they release into the soil that act as kind of natural herbicides. You do want to be careful. If you use these, you usually need to wait about a month before planting direct seeding, something like a lettuce or carrot, because not only will those chemicals have an allelopathic effect on weeds, but they'll also have an allelopathic effect on some vegetable plants as well. And then there's also pathogen and potential nematode suppression. And this is something that's been getting a lot more research over the past, say, 20 years, 30 years, is using cover crops as kind of biofumigants. So typically brassica cover crops, kind of like your mustards or even canola, those have natural chemicals in them referred to as isothiocyanates. And when you grow these cover crops and then chop them up and release them back into the soil, they release those isothiocyanates back into the soil, which can have kind of a biofumigant effect of suppressing certain soil-borne pathogens such as Fusarium or Phytophthora. So this is something there's been a lot of research in. A lot of organic strawberry growers down in California, they rotate their strawberries with a broccoli cover crop, or a broccoli crop, I should say. And they'll grow, they'll do strawberries for 3 years and then rotate out and do broccoli for about 3 years. And so you harvest the head of broccoli, and that allows them to have a harvestable crop because land and water is really expensive down there. So got to get something out of the field. But then you take the rest of the portion of that crop that's left behind, the stem, the leaves, everything else, you chip it up and turn it back into the soil, and you're getting that biofumigant effect from it. So they'll usually do that for about a 3-year period before they plant back into strawberries. And that 3-year rotation out of strawberries with a brassica type crop is generally enough to at least suppress the populations of, Fusarium or Phytophthora to a level that's low enough that they can actually produce a good strawberry crop. So again, there is economic value to cover crops, in terms of water conservation. It can reduce the amount of fertilizers or potentially pesticides that may need to be used. And for some, such as pea shoots, you can actually harvest and get some value out of them as well. I do want to note there are disadvantages, or maybe I should say challenges, to using cover crops as well. One is that you're going to have delayed soil warming in the spring. So that may mean that, especially here in Oregon, this can be a challenge. It takes a while. We usually have pretty cool springs, rainy, cool springs here in this part of Oregon. And so it can be hard for, farmers or gardeners to get out into their garden and plant. You need time for the sun to hit those soils, warm them up, and get them to a temperature that's conducive to direct seeding. So anytime you have the soil covered, it's going to be shading it. And so that's going to, essentially delay the time that it takes for that soil to warm up in the spring. So that can delay bed preparation and planting. So that is one of the major challenges, especially with winter cover crops, is getting them cut down, incorporated, and getting them to decompose in time for your garden the following year. It can also be really difficult to incorporate all that biomass back into the soil. So farmers have to have specific equipment when growing cover crops that they can then go through their field afterwards and mow down and chip up the cover crop and then turn it back into the soil. And then you have to wait for all that biomass to decompose. And it usually takes about 4 to 6 weeks. So you have to, kind of time when you want to get out there, plant your bed and cut down your cover crop about 4 to 6 weeks before that time. Some of them can actually be host plants for pathogens. So I've talked a lot, I just mentioned the benefits of growing brassicas as a biofumigant. That's actually not really recommended here in the Willamette Valley because you have clubroot, a fungus, a pathogen that impacts a lot of the brassica species. So if you're growing cabbages and broccolis and cauliflowers, those are all brassicas. And so if you're growing a brassica as a biofumigant cover crop, just keep in mind it's also a host for a fungus that's very common in this part of the Willamette Valley, and all you would be doing is essentially feeding that pathogen. So in this part, it's generally recommended that you maybe stick to grass or legume type cover crops, unless you know that you have a specific problem like Phytophthora that you're trying to deal with. Again, I mentioned the allelopathic effect of some of them, but that can be an issue with some of the small seeded vegetable crops like lettuce and carrots. So again, you just kind of have to wait a couple weeks after the cover crop's been terminated for those allelopathic chemicals and properties to decompose themselves before you can go in and plant. And then of course, there's just the cost of purchasing the seed for farmers. That's, planting a huge field. If you farm, say 50 acres, it's expensive to buy seed for that field, especially when you aren't going to be harvesting and selling something from that crop itself. So there's seed and fuel and labor and machinery. For home gardeners, the challenge is figuring out how to best incorporate these cover crops and dealing with all that biomass afterwards. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So just let me take a look at the time. So I'm doing pretty good. So there's a number of things to, consider when selecting a cover crop. So obviously you want to consider, what do you want to get out of this cover crop? Are you looking for soil protection? Do you want a nitrogen fixing species? Are you looking for, pathogen or disease suppression, weed suppression, etc.? Kind of think about what your goals are. Maybe it's building up the organic matter of your soil, and then choose a cover crop that's most appropriate for that goal. And usually what I recommend is people grow a mixture of species. And this is often how cover crops are sold. Like if you're looking in seed catalogs like Territorial Seed or Johnny's or whatever it may be, or even if you go down to like a local store like Down to Earth, they're usually going to sell a cover crop mix. And that mix is usually going to have some type of legume. So you're getting that nitrogen fixing benefits from it, some type of grass that's going to really help build up the organic matter. And sometimes it will include a mustard or brassica type crop as well. But I do recommend, mixed species. That way you're kind of getting multiple benefits from that cover crop mix. Okay, so the other thing you just want to think about is what's available and the cost. Limiting environmental factors. So obviously you want to, make sure you're growing winter cover crops during the winter time. You don't want to maybe try to grow, say, Sudan grass in the winter here in Oregon. So just know what the appropriate cover crops are for the seasons, and then choosing one that is best suited for your environment as well. Think about the carbon to nitrogen ratios as well. That's going to really impact the rate of decomposition. So legumes tend to have really low carbon to nitrogen ratios, meaning they're really high in nitrogen. And so they're going to be really fast to decompose. Whereas a lot of your cereals or grass cover crops, they're really high in things like lignans and cellulose that are really hard for all those soil organisms to break down and decompose. And they have a really high carbon and nitrogen ratio, and they're essentially going to have a much slower decomposition rate as well. So that's something to consider again when you're thinking about the challenge of then getting into your garden and planting in the spring. And then just think about the growth habit as well. Obviously, for weed suppression, you want something that's going to be really fast to establish itself, so it can kind of outcompete those weeds, but also provide some type of good canopy that's then going to shade out any weeds as well. So cover crops are typically broken down, or at least I'm going to break them down in this talk, into 3 categories. One is the legumes. So again, these are our nitrogen fixing cover crops that have that symbiotic relationship with the rhizobial bacteria. You're also going to get nutrient cycling and organic matter out of these as well, but those include vetch. Vetch is probably one of the most common cover crops that is grown. That little photo you see is hairy vetch. It produces those really pretty purple flowers. You know, alfalfa, clover, cowpeas, peas, and fava beans. Those are all legume cover crops. Grasses as well as cereals, those are typically the cover crops that are going to really add a lot of organic matter to the soil. They're also really important for erosion control and prevention. They have these great root systems that go really deep and also kind of cover the soil, so it protects it from wind and water. And they're really great for nutrient scavenging as well. So things like winter rye or annual rye, ryegrass, oats, Sudan grass, those are your typical grass or cereal cover crops. And then of course, as I noted, you have the brassica species that are act as biofumigants. Some of them are really good for breaking up compaction in the soil. There's certain species of like radish or daikon that you can grow that have these really deep root systems that can kind of, if you have a kind of a compacted layer underneath your soil, they can help kind of break that apart. And then of course, some of the mustards and other things are grown for the biofumigant effect as well. So when looking at cover crop species, if you're looking for a nitrogen fixing cover crop, as I noted, hairy vetch, those beautiful purple flowers, you've probably seen that before. That's a really common one. People will also grow maybe a white vetch. There's all sorts of different types of clovers involved. Some of them are perennial, so think about that. Those can be challenging to get rid of. They, you know, keep in mind that cover crops can become weeds as well if you allow them to grow and get out of control and produce seeds and drop them. So it is important that you manage your cover crops so that they don't become a challenge for you in the garden as well. Crimson clover, that one, if you drive around the spring and you see those fields covered in these beautiful red flowers, that's crimson clover. Bees love it. If you're looking to get, you know, plant a cover crop that's going to attract some pollinators, I recommend that one. Things like fava beans are great as well, and you can even harvest some of the favas and have something edible. There's certain types of peas that can be grown, and then of course alfalfa and sun hemp as well. If erosion control is kind of your main concern, and if there's some of you here today that maybe live in parts of the McKenzie River that were burned out and you're concerned, you may want to consider some erosion cover crops, not only this winter, but potentially next winter as well. So that's going to have something that has a really fibrous and extensive root system that's going to kind of act as like a netting and kind of hold the soil in place. So help increase aggregate stability in the soil. It's also going to have enough above ground biomass that's really going to protect your soil from the rain and the wind as well. So things like annual ryegrass, winter rye, there's certain types of barley, crimson clovers, even oats and triticale. These are all really great species to grow for erosion control and prevention. If you're really looking to build the organic matter of the soil, I know a lot of you that live out off of like Riverside Road, there's a lot of heavy clay soils out that way. If you have a really poor clay soil, one of the best things you can do is add organic matter to that soil. That's going to help improve the porosity of that soil, which will improve aeration and also water infiltration within that soil, and just make it a little easier to work with as well. So things that are going to add a lot of organic matter to the soil are alfalfa and your winter rye, annual ryegrass, sweet clover, and even your sorghum Sudan grass. So that would be used as a summer cover crop, not a winter cover crop. For nutrient scavenging, so something that will grow really fast, put its roots down really fast, and therefore take up any excess nitrogen up out of the soil. Phacelia is a great one. That's that beautiful flower that you see there on that upper right-hand corner. Things like canola, again, winter rye. You keep hearing me say winter rye. Winter rye has a lot of great benefits. It's one of the more common. cover crops that's grown, as well as annual ryegrass, sunflower, etc. All those are going to help scavenge some of those excess nutrients out of the soil. If you're looking, if you do have some type of compaction layer, there are some really deep-rooted cover crops that you can grow that can kind of help break up some of that compaction in the soil. So sweet clover is one of them. Also daikon radish, and you can actually see there that photo in the lower right-hand corner. You can see the depth of the root. That's going to help kind of break up the soil a little bit and increase pore space within that soil to a depth that's going to allow water then to infiltrate and pass through that soil a little easier. Okay, and then for weed suppression, for those that really will quickly outcompete weeds, so buckwheat's a summer cover crop. Pollinators love it. You know, it can quickly become a weed as well, so you do want to cut it down before it drops seed. Sorghum, Sudan grass, ryegrass, winter rye, oats, all of these are going to be great for weed suppression. If you're looking for more of that allelopathic effect, sorghum hybrids or winter rye are the best options. Okay, and then for pathogen or nematode suppression, so for that would be soil-borne pathogens, it's going to need to be a brassica, mustard. So brassicas, again, I'm talking, you know, cauliflower, cabbage, broccoli, etc. And then mustards and canola as well. So these are some of the best warm season cover crops for the Pacific Northwest, so this part of Oregon. So warm season, again, these are your summer cover crops. You plant them in the spring, allow them to grow into summer, and then cut them down in late summer, early fall. So buckwheat is a great one. Again, it smothers weeds. It really attracts, it puts out these pretty white flowers that pollinators love, beneficial insects love as well. Oats is another good one, and that's really great for erosion control and adding organic matter. And then once again, Phacelia, which I mentioned, those beautiful flowers that also attract a lot of pollinators, and that's going to add a lot of organic matter to the soil as well. In terms of the best cool season cover crops for the Pacific Northwest, you know, things like Austrian field peas is really great. So you're going to get nitrogen fixation out of that. A cereal rye, those are always really good, usually some type of winter rye or something like that. Crimson clover, again, that beautiful red flower that provides a lot of nitrogen fixation, attracts a lot of beneficial insects. It also does really good on poor soil. So if you have a really poorly drained or even an acid soil, crimson clover actually can do quite well on those. So that would be one you would want to consider. And then of course, hairy vetch, the old standard cover crop, those nice, pretty purple flowers, lots of nitrogen fixation with that. And it is a little tolerant of acid soils than some other legumes as well. And it is, with hairy vetch, it is recommended that you do mix it with some type of grass or cereal because, you know, it is more of a vining type legume species. It puts out those little tendrils, kind of like peas do, those little tendrils where it wants to latch on to something so it can climb. So oftentimes with peas and vetches, you do want to kind of mix them with some type of grass or cereal species so they have something they can latch onto and use for kind of trellising. So let's talk about planting a cover crop. So, you know, and I'll try to tackle this from the garden level, but basically you first want to select what type of cover crops you want to grow. And sometimes just looking in gardening catalogs, you know, check out what they have at Down to Earth, look at Territorial, check out, you know, Peaceful Valley or Johnny's or some of these others that are sold online and see what they sell and choose something that will kind of meet the goals that you have, whether it be nitrogen fixing or erosion, or maybe just a little bit of everything. Planting date is important. So again, you do want to plant about 4 to 6 weeks before, you know, the first killing frost, which in this part of the South Valley is usually sometime in mid-October to late October. I have planted cover crops later than that. And, you know, I've had mixed results. I've had years where, you know, I got lucky and we ended up with a really warm temperatures in late October, early November, and the cover crop germinated and took off in time for it to establish itself in winter. And then there's other times where it really was too late. You ended up with these really stunted little crops or even no germination or very poor germination as well. So it is important to get them in the ground so they have time to germinate and establish themselves before, the cold winter temperatures of late fall and winter. If you're growing, the first time you grow a legume cover crop, it's not a bad idea to inoculate the seed. So this little bag here that's called Guard In, that's a rhizobial inoculant. And you'll see the label says it can be used for peas, vetch, soybean, lentil, dry bean, etc. So that bag is going to contain basically a number of different species of rhizobial bacteria. And again, this rhizobium bacteria is the bacteria that has that symbiotic relationship with the legumes, fixes atmospheric nitrogen. So your soil will sometimes have natural populations of these rhizobia. Sometimes it's good to really inoculate your seed to build up that population in your soil. And the greater the population of rhizobium bacteria, the more rhizobia you're going to have working hard to fix nitrogen, and the better benefits or the greater nitrogen fixation you'll get out of that crop. So just keep in mind that rhizobium are species specific. So you have to make sure that you get a species that can essentially inoculate or has that symbiotic relationship with the type of cover crop that you're growing. Then you're going to basically prepare your soil, and you don't have to do much. I usually broadcast my seed in my home garden. If you're out farming, you probably have a seeder, that you can use. But for me, I tend to just, broadcast it, take a scoop in my hand and just kind of toss it, gently over the area that I will be planting. And then I usually try to rake it into the soil, just gently rake it into the top ½ inch of soil. And then you need to water it in and water it essentially until it germinates. I have had issues with like pigeons showing up and eating, everything very quickly. So I have done this where maybe I put a little straw mulch on the soil as well. If you have that issue where a bunch of birds show up the day after you plant a cover crop, try taking a little straw, putting it over the soil, and that will usually protect it enough that they get enough sunlight for it to still germinate and grow, but will also maybe deter some of those birds from flying into your garden and eating it all. This usually isn't a huge problem at the garden scale, but a lot of times with farmers, that can be a big issue where, the birds are watching and they know when you go out and plant all that seed in the soil and they show up the next day to eat it all. I do just want to say there's also a lot of work. One thing you're starting to see is people undersowing cover crops or interseeding them with their existing cover or their existing crop, the crop they're trying to grow for harvest. And as I noted in perennial cropping systems, this is very common. It's referred to as a living mulch because it's basically a perennial cover crop that constantly covers that soil between the rows of trees or vines and provides a lot of those benefits. And then they just go through and mow it every now and then to kind of keep it under control. You're also starting to see people do this with annual vegetables as well. So they'll, in the upper right-hand corner, that looks like some type of brassica that's growing with a cover crop interseeded underneath it. So I've seen this fail before. I've seen farmers go out where they plant, their crop as well as the cover crop seed at the exact same time. And essentially the cover crop ends up out competing the crop that they intended to grow for harvest and, kind of gets lost. So generally what you want to do is kind of delay the cover crop seeding until the crop you're trying to grow for harvest has actually established itself. So allow it to germinate, maybe drop its seed leaves and start to put out its true leaves. And then at that point, come in and undersow a cover crop underneath it. So just be aware of that. You also want to then pick a cover crop that's going to be tolerant of shade as well. So things like cereal rye, crimson clover, and hairy vetch tend to work best for that. And then, yeah, just be aware there's still a lot of research being done on this. And if you're doing it, especially with annual crops, like you want to interseed with your brassicas, just be aware it could compete with water and nutrients with those crops. So then once your cover crop's established, it takes off, it grows over winter. You don't really need to water it in this part of Oregon, which is nice. Then in the spring, you have this huge, garden filled with some type of grass or legume species that you need to cut down and deal with. So there's a lot of different ways you can do that. You typically want to cut it down once it flowers. So usually about when like 60% of the crop has flowered. You would then want to go into the field and cut it down. You need to be very good about cutting it down before it sets seed, because as I noted, some of these can easily turn into weeds themselves. So you want to get in, cut it down. You can use a scythe, you can use a string trimmer. I like string trimmers. You can kind of cut at a higher level and then at a lower level and chip it up into smaller pieces. The smaller the pieces you're able to cut it up into, the quicker it's going to decompose. So just keep that in mind. They also have push mowers you can use. And then of course, if you're a farmer, you probably have specialized equipment that you can then plant into. But again, you do want to incorporate the residues at least about 4 weeks before you intend to plant into that soil to give it time to decompose. The rate of decomposition is going to vary. It depends on moisture, temperature. The warmer it is, the faster it will decompose. If it's cold and rainy and soggy, it's going to be a really slow decomposition process. So that is a challenge here in Oregon, where we have these cool, wet, rainy springs, is getting these things turned in and decomposed in time so you can plant your summer garden. And then, some people are doing no-till. No-till, it can be challenging without herbicides, because if you don't, so typically what you would do is you'd cut down the cover crop and then come in with like a digging fork and turn it into the soil. And once you turn it into the soil, that's going to kind of increase soil contact with the biomass of the plant, and all those bacteria and fungi that live in the soil are going to start eating the cover crop and decomposing them. With no-till, what they do is they just mow down the cover crop and then plant directly into it. But in most no-till systems, they do use herbicides. And I should say no-till systems that are using cover crops, they do use herbicides to essentially kill the cover crop so that it doesn't continue to grow. Because I'm sure some of you have had that happen, where you cut down maybe a ryegrass or something, but its roots are still intact, and you go out a week later and you still have ryegrass growing back in your garden that somehow made a comeback. So that can be a challenge as well. So without, there is research being done into like organic no-till. It usually involves these big kind of roller crimpers that go through the field and essentially just kind of break up the cover crop enough to kill it. But for a small garden, I would recommend just turning it in, cut it down, turn it in, let it decompose. So in terms of tips for beginners, I always say, start with something that's fairly easy to grow and manage. Crimson clover is pretty easy to incorporate. It's not going to create a bunch of challenges for you by growing back after you've incorporated it. So that's usually a good one. And then also when you first start, only do it in a portion of your garden that you're going to use for late spring or early summer. Like a good place to start is where you're going to plant your tomatoes. Tomatoes don't go in the ground until May, if we're lucky here. And so, if you put a cover crop where you're going to have your tomatoes in the ground, you can come in, cut down your cover crop in late March, early April, and that's going to give it at least a month to decompose before you would then come in and transplant your tomato crop. So that's a great way. Just start with an area. You don't want to, the first time you're dealing with a cover crop, you don't want to be using it in an area that you want to get into in early spring for, your brassicas or lettuces or things like that, because you may not have time to get that cover crop to decompose, and it can be challenging. So, start with an area that you'll be planting late, and that gives you time to deal with the cover crop residues. And then once you've had success with that, then you can kind of branch out and start experimenting with other types of cover crops. Okay, so just real quick, OSU has a few good publications on growing cover crops. You can get these from the OSU Extension Catalog. One is referred to as Cover Crops for Home Gardeners, and you can just write down these codes right now. So FS 304, EC 1653, and PNW 646. If you just do a Google search for like OSU Extension plus that code, these publications should pop right up. And then just for those of you that really want to dig into cover crops, this Managing Cover Crops Profitably is a very good book. It's kind of really the known book. It's one that farmers use. It has these great charts on cover crops, and you can actually find it and download it for free from the Western SARE website as well. Okay. So with that, I think I'll go ahead and open it up. I'll just go back here so people can write that up, but I'll go ahead and try to address some of the questions in the Q&A section. Cover crop over fall bulbs. I've never tried that. That's a good question. I would need to experiment with that. I think the key is, how would you deal with the cover crop in the spring with the bulbs in the ground? Because you have to turn the cover crop into the soil. And so then you'd be digging up the bulbs. If you don't turn the cover crop in, then you're going to have this thin layer, maybe you just mow it down. You're going to basically shade out where the bulbs are. So I don't know how that would work, honestly. And another question from Tina, mixing cover crops. Yeah, white mustards. The ones I mentioned that have allelopathic effects, like the sorghum Sudan's, those are the ones that you really want to be careful with in terms of mixes. And that's why it's good when you're starting. Just look at the mixes they have in some of the catalogs. They've done the research on that. They know that those mixes work well together. Instead of trying to make your own mix, just kind of go with what these garden stores supply, especially if you're going to a good gardening store like Down to Earth or Territorial. They've done the research. They know what the good cover crop mixes are. Let's see, go down and try to get some other folks cover questions in. I think I already addressed during my talk, cover crops for good wet clay soil, any of those grasses that are going to be, adding a bunch of organic matter into your clay soil. That's really what you want to focus on. So any type of ryegrass, those are usually great for heavy clay soils. I'm not aware of allelopathic cover crop research into noxious weeds. Doesn't mean it hasn't happened. I'm not aware of it having any effect on English ivy, but maybe there's somewhere out there in the world doing that type of research. So under your apple tree, immediately under your apple tree, you're going to want to have a bark mulch, because if you put a cover crop directly under your trees where they're kind of right up against the bark of the tree, they're going to be taking up water and nutrients right underneath that area, but also that they're going to kind of be touching the lower trunk of the tree. That moisture contact on the lower trunk of the tree could cause some issues as well. So I would do a bark mulch directly under the apple tree, but then in the areas outside of that, in the aisles, between trees, you can then do a cover crop in that area. So someone's asking, decomposition and no-till. Have you seen anyone cut and cover with, say, black plastic, newspaper, cardboard for moisture heat? Yeah, so a lot of the organic farms that refer to themselves as no-till, they're usually doing things like sheet mulching, right? It's not, because again, if you just cut down and mow a cover crop, it will grow back. You're just essentially taking off the top portion, the root's still intact. So that can be a challenge in organic systems if you want to do no-till and don't want to turn it in. So a lot of these people do combine cover cropping, or they just do sheet mulching. Sheet mulching is also a great way to kind of build up organic matter, cover your soil during the winter time, and prevent it from harsh winter rain. So I don't know that I've seen it used in combination with black plastic, but certainly with newspaper mulch. Let's see. Yeah, it is getting a bit late, especially for something like a clover. It really depends on what the temperatures are going to be over the next couple weeks. Using daikon, do you pull up the radish? You basically kind of want to till it in, essentially. So you could pull it up and eat it. So people do that. You can actually get the benefits of getting a harvest out of it, or you can just till it back into the soil. you have crops in the ground now, how do you get a cover crop in? Well, you would have to underseed them. So that's where you would come in with maybe something low growing, some type of clover, like a white clover, and just interseed underneath the crops that you already have in the growing. Can you share the second resource slide? I'll do that again. So usually with things like adding lime, you want to do that, say like a couple of weeks maybe before you plant your cover crop. Just give it a little time to react with the soil before you put the seed in the ground. And is there a clover beneficial to cherry trees? I'm not, I know for hazelnut trees, they do things like fine fescue, tall fescue, things like that. I don't know specifically for cherry trees, but most cover crops are going to be okay. You just want to have them with orchard crops. You really just want to have them in the aisles. You don't want them directly below the tree itself. So just kind of keep them in the areas between the aisles. And honestly, regardless of which cover crop you plant, it should have some benefits. So we're at 11:58, so I'm over time, so I apologize, but I do need to stop there because we need to allow time for the next speakers to get on. So with that, I'll stop screen share. Thank you everyone for joining me this morning. I apologize I couldn't get to all your questions, but I appreciate you being here with us. Over to you, Jan.
Thanks, Erica. That was great. So we'll take a couple of seconds for the next group, the composting group, to get on together here. Hold on. Okay, Patty, do you want to set yours up since you're first? Patty? Okay. When?
Okay, just this.
Okay, so before, as Patty is getting ready, I'll go ahead and introduce them. But I want to let y'all know before we get started with our second class, I'd like to remind everybody that you'll be muted and there will be times for questions during each session. And we're hoping that we'll be reading the questions out loud. To ask questions, please enter your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We will answer as many questions as we can during the time allotted. If you have any additional questions, please contact your local extension service, and other information such as links will be entered in the chat box, and there will be a couple from this session also. So
Can you see it, Jan?
yeah, okay, so let me introduce. So our second hour is on composting. Some like it hot. Composting questions answered. Why should you compost? The benefits are many. Compost enriches soil, reduces the need for fertilizer. It helps the soil to hold moisture. Composting encourages the production of beneficial bacteria and fungi and suppresses plant disease and pests. And composting reduces waste in landfills. This talk hopes you will find the best method for you. There'll be 3 short presentations followed by a question and answer session. The first presentation is on hot compost presented by Patty Driscoll. Patty Driscoll has been an Oregon State University Extension Service Master Gardener since 1993 in Lane County and a compost specialist since 1999. For composting, Patty likes to build hot piles when she has enough greens and browns to fill up her compost bin. She also likes to sheet compost to renew an old bed or start a new bed. And she loves to see all the soil life in the compost. Patty is also a pruning specialist, landscape specialist, and tree fruit specialist with the Master Gardener program in Lane County. So go ahead, Patty.
Okay, so some like it hot. So hot composting is an art and a science of mixing organic materials in a pile and making sure the pile has the right amount of what it needs to do its thing. So you need air, water, nitrogen, carbon. And with turning, heating up, and time, the original materials decompose and transform into a stable humus. Next, we'll cover what to compost. Grains are high in nitrogen, browns are a low in nitrogen source for